we need to generate jobs. That's going to be the key consideration as we try and come out of this horrendous pandemic and all the restrictions. How do we recreate those jobs that have been smashed over the last 4 months with all the restrictions? How do we get people off JobKeeper, off JobSeeker, and back into the real economy? Heavens above, 52% of Victorian salary earners are being paid by the government at the moment. I mean, Victoria is in a state of socialism because of these restrictions.
Welcome to Frank Talk. I'm Albert Dadon, your host today. I have with me Tim Smith. I believe that you are in your electorate office, Tim.
I am indeed out there. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. So you're a member of the lower house of the Victorian Parliament?
That's correct. I was elected as the member for Kew in 2014. And I've been the member for Kew now, 6 years. I'm the Shadow Minister for Planning, Housing and Local Government. And prior to that, I was the Shadow Minister for Education.
You're a young man. You're less than 40 years old. I mean, because you're less than 40, we can say your age is 36.
I'm 36.
And that, so therefore you were elected to Parliament, you were not quite 30 yet.
I was 30, I just turned 31.
Okay. And so prior to being a member of Parliament, I know that you were educated at the Scotch College.
That's correct. And
you were meeting on the bus my daughter-in-law. It's lucky, by the way, that you never dated her, because you would have deprived me of my 3 grandchildren.
That's such a funny story. When you told me that if I asked whether or not I'd ever met a girl called Ebony, and I said, oh, the name rings a bell, and you said it was my daughter-in-law. And I was like, no, that's impossible. That just can't be. I haven't seen her since I was in year 12. That is just incredible.
Yeah, indeed. It's a small world, but of course the world is very small when you live in Melbourne. So since that time, therefore, let's go from Scotch College. What did you do? What was your education, and how did you progress to become a member of Parliament?
So I did a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Melbourne, and I was at Ormond College. And I certainly spent much more time rowing than I did studying as an undergraduate. I was a member of the Australian rowing team for 5 years and got a bronze medal from the World Championships in 2004 in the men's lightweight 8. I was an AIS, Australian Institute of Sport, full scholarship holder. Had a very bad back, so I rowed the 2005 World Championships in the lightweight 4 and the 2006 World Championships in the lightweight pair, where we came 4th. And unfortunately, I had a very bad back. I had to take a couple of years off and went back to university and did a Masters in International Relations, and ended up finishing it at the London School of Economics, which is when I really got bitten by the political bug. Got an internship in the House of Commons with a very, very funny English MP called David Amos, who's the member for Southend West in Essex. Hilarious fellow. And because of that experience, I got a job with British David Davis, who was the Shadow Home Secretary at the time, and I think you'll recall was the Brexit Secretary after Theresa May took over after David Cameron lost the leadership of the Conservative Party in 2016 after the Brexit referendum. And so I finished my Masters, came home in the end of 2008, got a job very briefly with Malcolm Turnbull, and there's quite a funny story behind that, because I was originally offered the job by Tony Abbott. And then Malcolm's then Chief of Staff, Peter Credlin, offered me a job in the Leader's office, to which Tony told me to take the job with Malcolm, and which I did. But I'd already nominated for local council elections in Victoria. And I tried to withdraw from the Stonington local council elections. And what happened was there was no provision in the Act to withdraw your candidacy. So I went up to Canberra to work for Malcolm with the knowledge that if I didn't campaign, surely I couldn't get elected. Well, as it turned out, that was erroneous, because I remember sitting in the Manuka McDonald's one Sunday being called by someone in Melbourne saying, "Guess what, councillor? You've been elected, you'd better come back to Melbourne." And this created quite a lot of controversy in the opposition leader's office at the time. And I was promptly told to go back to Melbourne to become a local councillor, which I did. So I stayed as a councillor at Stonington until 2012. Mm-hmm. And I was the mayor of Stonington in 2009, 2010. I was the then youngest ever mayor of Stonington when I was 25 or 26. And we ran a huge campaign against the then Brumby Labor government on their decision to extend clearways through Stonington, down High Street, in particular in Armidale. I don't know if you remember this, Albert. We made the point that for the small businesses and for the local traders, if people can't park throughout the day, then they can't shop. Because what the Labor Party was trying to do was increase the period of that a clearway was enforced from whatever it is, 7 till 9 in the morning and 4:30 till 6:30 in the evening, from 6:30 in the morning to 10 a.m. and then 3 p.m. till 7 p.m. So that all the traders were saying, well, we've only got, if we can't allow mums, particularly after school pick up and drop off, to park, no one will go shopping. So we'll go broke. So we fought them on this. We ended up in the Supreme Court for 6 months. And as a consequence, we won the seat of Paran. And one of the first things Ted Baillieu did when he became Premier was to reverse the clearway times in Stonington. So I was very, very proud of that as a young mayor and standing up for the local traders in Stonington. So, and then I went and worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers for a couple of years in their consulting practice, and then had my pre-selection for Kew in 2014, the start of 2014, and then got elected to the Parliament in November 2014.
So when you decided to become a member of Parliament, I believe there was some opposition within the party. Tell us about that.
Well, it would be fair to say that not everyone was particularly over the moon by my candidacy for the seat of Kew. And look, this was no one's fault, really. This was a failure of the party organisation at the time to manage these issues in an appropriate way that essentially allowed everyone to fulfil their ambitions. So what happened was Mary Wooldridge's seat of Doncaster was abolished by the Electoral Commission. Wasn't her fault at all. The former member for Kew, Andrew McIntosh, announced that he was not going to contest the 2014 election. And so Mary put her hand up for Kew. I had been very active in the branches in Kew and Kooyong for quite some time. And I had a lot of support in the branches in Kew to be the next member for Kew. I asked the branch members whether or not I should withdraw, given that Mary was a senior cabinet minister. And they made it very clear that they wanted me to run because they wanted me to be their MP. So I decided to run. The Liberal Party is a democracy after all. And Mary also ran. And this was I hugely regret that this ever happened. It should never have happened. Mary should have been found a seat. People should have listened to me and to my supporters when we told them at the time that I had the numbers, and that was proven some months later at the pre-selection where I won by quite a significant margin. And I think if the Premier at the time and others had listened, we would have avoided what was a very ugly mess at the start of an election year. But, hindsight's a wonderful management tool, as you know, out there, and these things are as they are, and we move on.
But wait a minute. You were really pressured. Jeff Kennett called you to his office. What happened there?
Well, Jeffrey expressed his desire that I not contest Kew, and look, no one can quite convey a message like Jeffrey Kennett. I love Jeff Kennett. There's a way about Jeffrey that's unique, and he conveyed to me in very direct terms that I ought to make way for Mary. I declined to do so. And we are where we are today.
Yeah, fair enough. Jeff Kennett, I remember in the 90s when he was going against John Kerner. I think well before Donald Trump. He's the first politician I remember that started giving nicknames to his opponents. I won't remind you what the nickname was for the late John Kerner, but at the time it was quite funny, and it stick with the public because everybody was calling her by that name, and Jeff, of course, had fantastic two terms. I think that at the time when he lost, I think he was short of at least one term. Don't you agree?
Well, I think it was a tragedy for Victoria that the Liberal Party and Jeff Kennett lost the 1999 election. And I think, frankly, I don't think the party's ever quite recovered from that defeat in terms of the psychology of any organisation which has been subsequently been relatively unsuccessful. I mean, we've been now out of office for the best part of 20 years in Victoria, and that's now that lack of success, I think, weighs very heavily on a lot of Liberal Party members' shoulders. Certainly weighs very heavily on my shoulders, because you're seeing now successive Labor governments entrenching very poor practices in the public service. And that, I think, explains a number of the shortcomings we've seen in the public administration of Victoria during this crisis, because we've got political appointments throughout the public service that are clearly not up to the task for which they were appointed, and all the institutions of the state being so controlled by a dominating premier, not giving him the advice he needs to hear, or whether or not he's incapable of hearing it, that's a separate question. This has all led to, I think, the quarantine disaster, where various different agencies of the government haven't been speaking to one another, and no one knew who was responsible for what. And as a consequence, the virus escaped, got back out into the community, and we are now where we are, which is a stage 4 lockdown, 7,500 active cases, and economic catastrophe.
Yes, I mean, we heard yesterday that there is, in fact, the socialist left of the Labour Party, which is the party in power at the moment, let's be honest, they've got this doctrine of intersectionality that needs to be applied throughout the ranks of the Victorian government and administration. You obviously heard about that.
Well, people should be appointed on merit. People should be appointed on merit to undertake the tasks which they're expected to do. And the simple fact is that we've appointed security guards as a very good example. Security guards who are untrained and were not up to the task. And look what happened. Just look what happened. We are now in an economic catastrophe. The Andrews Labor government and successive Labor governments have put issues of political correctness, for want of a better description, ahead of appointing the right people, the best people, based on merit, for difficult jobs.
But there was a time when an equal opportunity was introduced.
Yep.
And look, you could think whatever about equal opportunity, but it was introducing an element of fairness, because kind of reestablishing a balance, especially in government, that was fair. But I think that now this thing is completely reversed. Like, if you are a white person, you are going to be discriminated against. That's what this means.
Look, I completely agree to the extent that I think the balance has shifted far too far the other way now. I completely support equal opportunity legislation. And yes, for decades, women in particular were discriminated against in terms of employment opportunities in the public service, for example. I mean, heavens above, they had to resign when they got pregnant and got married. This was just disgraceful, discriminatory, disgraceful, and it ensured that the public policy outcomes were invariably not as good as they would have been if there'd been women at the table. So, no, I completely support equal opportunity legislation, and also around issues of religion and race. I mean, for years, people of a non-Anglo-Celtic, non-Protestant/Catholic disposition were barred from important jobs in the federal and Commonwealth, federal and state governments and across the country. I mean, this was shocking stuff, and it led to very, very poor outcomes and a very insular, backwards-looking Australia. And over the last 30 to 40 years, we've opened successive Labor and Liberal governments at the federal level have opened the country up and ensured that there was I think it was the Fraser government that first brought in a number of equal opportunity measures, and this has been to Australia's great benefit to allow all citizens to make a contribution, and I think that's been our great benefit. And having a multicultural, multi-religious, free, open and tolerant society that's outward facing with the rest of the world, that's open for business, open to new ideas, and frankly prepared to compete on our own 2 feet equally as an independent nation in the Asia Pacific. That new Australia is what has brought such prosperity to our nation for the best part of 3 decades. Frankly, until now, when we've unfortunately had to close everything back down to save us from this terrible virus. I mean, it's really quite incredible. I mean, we've closed the country, we've closed the borders for the first time in our history. We've closed ourselves off from the rest of the world. We spent the last 30 or 40 years opening ourselves up to the rest of the world. And now we've gone back the other way, largely because we kind of had to, really.
Yes, there is much to say about this. Let's say it. So, closing of the borders, is that a measure that you think is constitutional? I mean, there's a lot that's been said so far about the Constitution, about those who like to interpret it and those who just stick to the letter of the Constitution. But if we are unable to rely on the written document, why have a Constitution at all?
Well, I'll be frank, I don't believe the closure of state. I'm not offering a view as to whether or not what various states are doing, it might not be in their interests. I mean, if I was living in Adelaide at the moment, would I like to have the state border closed with Victoria? Well, I probably would, to be honest. But that's not the question you're asking me. You're asking me whether or not I think it's constitutional, and I don't believe that it is. I don't believe our founding fathers ever had any intention of allowing the South Australian government from stopping a Victorian from crossing the border. There is an absolute guarantee of the free flow of capital from across state boundaries. That's guaranteed. That is without, you can't, that is what essentially the founding fathers attempted to do with New Zealand was to create a free trade bloc amongst the then British colonies of Australasia. So that is, there is no doubt that you cannot, the internal tariffs within Australia have always been outlawed by the Constitution, if you like, to call them tariffs. But it is still up to 120 years later. No one has actually tested whether or not the free flow of people throughout Australia's internal borders can be blocked by a state. And I think the High Court has been asked this question, and particularly with regards to Western Australia, and I will be very intrigued to see what the High Court finds, because I don't believe the Constitution ever had any intent of disallowing Australian citizens to move from one state to another.
So we were talking earlier about the problems that your party, the Liberal Party of Victoria, had since Jeff Kennett, who was no longer the Premier, but you did have a term with Bellew, as you know, in between. And so I think as an outsider, I can offer you this proposition, is that where the biggest failure of your party has been is to select the right leader. I mean, Jeff Kennett was a formidable leader, okay, it's a one in a generation or maybe in two or three, but surely you can find better than the leaders that you had so far in your party. And I'm sorry if I extend this remark to your current leader.
Well, it would be fair to say, and I agree with you about this, that the previous Liberal government, led by Ted Baillieu and subsequently by Dennis Napthine, was very disappointing. I don't think anyone would suggest otherwise. I don't think they fulfilled the hopes of many in the party when we were elected unexpectedly in 2010. The government did do some good things. It failed to sell its achievements. But basically, it spent its first 2.5, 3 years doing very little, or if it was doing things, it didn't tell anyone what it was doing. A first-term premier resigned within 3 years of taking office. So it really was not a very successful period in the party's history. And in terms of leaders subsequent to Baillieu and Napthine, look, being an opposition leader is a very difficult job. I do think Matthew Guy did a really good job.
I agree with you. I would make that Matthew would be the exception of what I said before.
I think Matthew did a really good job keeping us together after a first-term defeat. And what happened to Matthew at the 2018 election was a tragedy. And a lot of it really was not his fault at all. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull was rolled within 3 months of the election. We saw what that did to by-election results in New South Wales. We saw what it did to the result of the Wentworth by-election after Malcolm resigned from the Parliament. And I think people were still very angry with the party for that level of destabilisation that had gone on in Canberra, and we bore that full frontal here in Victoria. And you were also dealing with a Labor government led by Daniel Andrews that had very simply delivered on their promises, which was a complete juxtaposition to what the previous Liberal government hadn't done. I mean, the previous Liberal government had been elected on a platform of fixing the problems and building for the future. Well, it didn't do any of that, really. It tried to in the end with the East-West link, but it was all too late. The current Labor government, on the other hand, said that it would remove level crossings, and it did. You know, essentially, Labor were rewarded for being a government that essentially delivered on their promises, and that is the other reason why I think we were so badly defeated in 2018.
Yes, I mean there were some mistakes that were made, obviously, by Ted Baillieu. Ted signed an agreement with the unions based on rates, on the construction unions, based on rates that were unaffordable for the construction industry. He did that because he wanted to finish the desalination plants, if you recall. And that has a flow-on effect to the industry to this day, because we talk about housing affordability, and you can't have housing affordability when the construction labor cost has run away to the point that it has. I'm not sure whether you are, as the shadow planning minister, you're probably familiar with that, actually. You would be.
I'll be very familiar with it. I've always actually asked the industry, you know, the average cost of an apartment in Melbourne is what? $700,000?
For a 2-bedroom, that's about right. For a 1-bedder, it varies between 450 to 600.
And these properties would be what, 10% cheaper if there was a far more sensible deal between capital and labour?
Oh, it could be even more than that, because you have an element of productivity that comes into play. I'll give you some example. There are restrictions. I believe it's 35 degrees. So if it's 35 degrees, the guys walk off the job. After 35 hours, it becomes double time. In certain sites, the shifts are completely unaffordable. I mean, you have to compare what we do in this part of the world with our Asian neighbors. For instance, if you go to Singapore, you can have 3/8. With 3/8, they finish a building within a year that would take us 2.5 to build. Just on that, imagine the interest rate cost that you are saving. And of course, our neighbors, they allow foreign workers, which we don't allow in Australia, and I can understand that. But by doing that, you're creating an inflation, because by not having foreign workers coming to Australia, then you rarefy the workforce, and of course you've got then wage pressures.
Yeah, and look, you know, we can't always compare ourselves to countries like Singapore. I mean, there are very different cultural elements to a lot of this. But I do agree that, you know, when you hear about someone holding a stop sign on a building site being paid $120,000, meanwhile a nurse is paid $50,000 or $60,000, I think there is something inherently wrong in that situation. And
you probably know that cleaners on the building site are paid about the amount you just said, between $120,000 and $150,000. The question is, how much is an inspector of police being paid today?
Not that much.
Exactly. So,
and I would say, I mean, look, construction is dangerous work, and I think for the guys who are very skilled, who are working, you know, at very great heights in dangerous roles, yeah, I think that having appropriate compensation for them and very stringent safeguards in terms of safety is very important for those very skilled high-end workers who are miles up in the air constructing high-rise buildings. But at the same time, when you, as you quite correctly observe, when someone's holding a stop sign or is working in a relatively unskilled part of the supply chain on a building site, you do question whether or not the deal that has been done between capital and labour is in everyone's best interests.
And of course, labour, well, Daniel Andrews, I should say, not labour per se, because when you had Steve Bracks and even Brumby, they were pro-business. Those two premiers were pro-business, no doubt about it. The economy didn't slow down in Victoria while they were the premiers. So I think that traditional labour and traditional liberals, there's no problem about their wanting to have growth in the state and do the right thing by everyone. Of course, their policies, like we saw the silly policy of Brumby, of wanting to restrict parkings during trading hours in major shopping arteries, that was nonsensical, and it costed him the election, really. But when Daniel Andrews came into power, he brought with him a certain element of the fringe left on the really socialist extreme left. One of them is currently the Minister for Planning, as you know. And so the first thing they did was to take away the incentive for stamp duty that was still allowing us to sell our apartments to overseas purchasers. That was gone. And then very quickly after that, they brought in some laws regarding heights, bringing in some ratios that we have to abide with. That was never the case in Melbourne. And suddenly sites that we paid $20, $30, $40 million became a fraction of that value overnight. No warning, no consultation. That is a big deal. I mean, that's really completely inconsiderate towards business, inconsiderate towards the economy when you think that, I don't know exactly the development and construction industry, what portion of the economy it is, but considering all the direct and indirect employment that it creates, I think it's the major force in Victoria, don't you think?
So for example, the height changes. So what we understand as a planning amendment called C270, which greatly reduced the height limits, the plot ratios, and increased the setback requirements for high-rise towers in the central city of Melbourne, has devastated that industry, as you know.
Absolutely.
And it also brought in an element of sovereign risk where overnight the basic premise of high-rise development and the land value attached changed overnight by the signature of a planning minister. The value of various sites around the city changed overnight. That obviously recalibrated yields, volumes, heights, and the requirements in terms of what people were trying to achieve with their development. And this has essentially put a noose around the neck of the development industry right in the centre of Melbourne. That's why, up until very recently, you've seen virtually no new developments approved by the planning minister, because a lot of developers and a lot of big development companies have looked at the planning scheme and said, well, we actually can't get a return here. And that's why, up until recently, you've seen very few approvals. Now, we've been calling on Richard Wynne and the Labor Party to abolish C270 for years now, because I'll be frank, I want to protect the suburbs of Melbourne from inappropriate development, absolutely. But at the same time, I want to see large-scale projects that generate jobs and investment in the centre of Melbourne. It's, before COVID started, there was a commercial occupancy rate of 97% in Melbourne. It was full. Now, obviously, that's now going to completely change, and I think will change forever. I think there's going to be a lot more people working from home, etc. And you're hearing about large banks mothballing floors of buildings and all that sort of stuff. So that's obviously there's going to be a real shift in the dynamic of development in the city now from commercial to residential and the like, I expect. But we need to generate jobs. That's going to be the key consideration as we try and come out of this horrendous pandemic and all the restrictions. How do we recreate those jobs that have been smashed over the last 4 months with all the restrictions? How do we get people off JobKeeper, off JobSeeker, and back into the real economy? Heavens above, 52% of Victorian salary earners are being paid by the government at the moment. I mean, Victoria is in a state of socialism because of these restrictions. I mean, this is quite incredible. Over half the employees in Victoria are being paid by the government in one way, shape or form at the moment. So we've got to reopen the economy, and how in a pretty constrained environment where I think we're still going to have our foreign borders restricted for quite some time. How are we going to generate those jobs? Well, construction has to be a part of this. And you can't just look at this from the perspective of, from a planning minister's perspective, we'll just tick off a few new buildings. No, we actually need to rethink the planning scheme in central Melbourne to give that incentive for the development and construction industry to reinvest. And equally, what you were saying about some of the tax incentives that have been taken away from state and federal governments over the last little while, I think they need to be reconsidered as well, because we need to shift the economy, which was doing pretty well up until COVID hit, really, comparatively. I mean, I know it wasn't like it was pre-GFC where it was booming, but it wasn't going too badly. And I think it was being very managed very well by Josh Frydenberg up in Canberra. But we now need to move to, we now are in a completely different phase. We are in the greatest economic hole we've been in probably since the Depression. It's going to have to be genuine incentives and a genuine effort in red tape reduction for industries like yours to get it back on its feet.
Yes, and it will be incumbent to young leaders like yourself. I think that for the next generation, I'm afraid, Tim, we will be looking at young leaders like yourself to rebuild with very sensible policies to give us the opportunity to rebuild. Because
Yeah.
now I think we reach a point beyond repair. I mean, how long this is going to take us to get back to just, close to where we were? I think it's not going to be the case for a decade. I tell you, I operate hotels, as you know, and the turnover has been smashed by more than 95%. I mean, we're talking about the construction industry, that's one thing, but the accommodation in the city, unless you've got a contract with the government to have some people to have in confinement in hotels, then you are unable to survive in this environment. We got approached by the government last week, Tim, and they asked us to provide them with some rooms for people that needed to be confined for because they were testing positive, for $100 a room. Or $100 a room, and it cost us $800 to clean a room with COVID. That's what we calculated, and they're offering us $100. So not only have they smashed our business to nearly zero, certainly we're creating losses now. It's not even zero. It's minus. I can't tell you how much money we're losing. But on top of that, they want us to create more losses.
So what they're trying to isolate positive COVID cases, not people, not returned travellers, but
that's right.
Australian citizens, local residents who've tested positive in your hotels, and they've offered you $100 per room.
Yeah, that's the rack rate is about $250. They offered $100, and it cost us $800 to clean. It's just not a commercial proposition at all. But the positive side was that the Victorian government seems to be wanting to do something about those cases that are positive. I don't know the details of that. I can just imagine what they're trying to do. To me, one of the biggest issues that we have at the moment, I canvassed that a few days ago with your good mate, with Michael Kroger. I think that the main issue about the transmission in the community of this virus is now from people that are simply testing positive. They know they are positive, but instead of staying in confinement, they just pretend that they have no issues and they continue about their business. According to the Victorian government, a third of the cases are doing that. And because of those people, we are all in a state of lockdown. I think that the easy remedy would be to get tough on those people and to let the rest of us who do the right thing, who do not test positive so far, to go about our business. I mean, that would be a simple solution. Do you have an idea to give to the Premier?
Yeah, I do, and I've said this quite a few times on TV and radio now, which is this at its heart is very simple. You need to start with the basic premise, and the basic premise is quite simple. Keep everyone with coronavirus away from everyone that doesn't have coronavirus. So people who have tested positive, if they go back out into the community knowing that they're positive, then they should face serious criminal sanctions. Serious criminal sanctions. The sort of criminal sanctions that you are faced with, where we've seen tragically over the last 40 years, where people who have been known to have tested positive for HIV/AIDS have had unprotected sex with people who didn't have HIV/AIDS and passed on the virus, and they passed it on knowingly. They face and still face very significant criminal sanctions all around the world for doing that. I think those sorts of criminal sanctions should be applied to those people who go out into the community knowing that they have coronavirus. So that's the punishment side of things. In terms of the preventative tool, well, ankle bracelets, tracking devices, use the police or the army to patrol streets where we know that there are positive cases. In short, make these people stay in their houses, and if for whatever reason they can't isolate in their house, then compulsory quarantine at their own expense in a hotel. And if they're sick, stick them in a hospital. I mean, this is very, very simple stuff. Anyone that's got coronavirus has to isolate until they're better. And here's the other thing. Unlike the United States, we're not testing people when they've finished their 2 weeks of isolation after testing positive. We're not testing them at the end of that fortnight to guarantee that they're no longer positive or contagious. And this virus is still, the doctors don't really understand a lot about it. They're obviously learning more and more every day, but it is still a very confusing and new virus. So we don't really know how it reacts in everyone. So I think there are a couple of ideas. Some are draconian, some are coercive, some are common sense. But I mean, with 7,500, 8,000 active cases in Victoria, 1,000 cases in health workers, and 2,500 cases out there where no one really knows how these people contracted the virus, that is what's scaring me. If we had 8,000 cases and the government knew exactly how and where and why everyone contracted the virus, then you could build a ring round each and every person and stop them from spreading it. What I'm trying to say here is that our contact tracing has been abysmal. And that, I think, was the responsibility of Annalise Van Diemen, who was the Deputy Chief Health Officer, who has been dismissed from that role. Now, we know that New South Wales is doing their contact tracing much better than ours. I've said a few times, whoever's running contact tracing in New South Wales, can we get them down to Victoria to explain to our people how it's done? Because clearly whatever we're doing in Victoria isn't working.
One major factor, I think, is the ideology running this government, where business interests runs very low in the priority. Because if it did not, they would find other ways. I cannot believe that the only way forward is to actually do whatever and completely disregard the economical flow of their decisions. They totally don't care about the unintended consequences. Nothing is being looked at. I think it goes now to the reckless behavior. It is, to me, it's reckless, it's negligent, I can't believe that they are threatening businesses with enormous fine if we have a person within our responsibility that would die from COVID, and they will absolutely face no consequence. The ministers, the government face absolutely no consequence whatsoever for the mess that they created.
Well, it's a very good point that you raise. I think that if there's going to be investigations into various different private sector firms where their staff have contracted COVID, well, frankly, I think the Minister for Jobs, Martin Bakula, the Police Minister, Lisa Neville, Daniel Andrews, the Premier, and Jenny Mikakos, the Health Minister, they should also be investigated for potential industrial manslaughter and criminal negligence charges, because their negligence caused the second wave of coronavirus that has led to deaths, hundreds of deaths, 250,000 people losing their job, billions of dollars being expended by the Commonwealth to prop up the Victorian economy. These people, through their negligence, have caused mayhem and destruction, and frankly, they should have the book thrown at them for this. If not, they should all lose their jobs inevitably, either now or at the end of this crisis, because they've failed in their duty. They have monumentally failed Victorians.
So, Tim, what do you think of the fact that the Parliament isn't sitting, that there is a very limited opportunities for the opposition to scrutinize the government. What is this idea that we're living in times where there are exceptional measures in place, and that's the time where you'd think you would need the highest scrutiny of government, and yet that is the time where they're closing all scrutiny?
Well, Albert, this is when having a history degree, I think, is to someone's great benefit, because history teaches us that this is exactly the time where informed citizens, a free press, an active opposition in Parliament and beyond Parliament have to ask the hard questions of government. This is not a war. This is a civil emergency. Our liberties have been eroded. The Parliament has been closed down, essentially. In Victoria, the oversight committee that the Parliament appointed to keep the government in check after they gave themselves more power than any government has ever had, frankly, on this continent since responsible government, so since 1855, is controlled by the Labor Party. That committee is controlled by the Labor Party. So at least in Canberra, the Parliament will meet, and the Oversight Committee appointed by the Senate doesn't have a government majority, nor should it. But here in Victoria, the Parliament, I think, won't meet, well, the lower house won't meet where we can question the Premier, won't meet for months. The Oversight Committee is controlled by Labor. I'm hearing good news that the upper house may well meet next week again. It met for one day last week, where the Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos, made an idiot of herself by refusing to answer any questions. I mean, this is where we need our institutions. This is where parliamentary democracy is vital. I mean, heavens above. At the height of World War II, after the House of Commons had been bombed into smithereens by the Nazis, the House of Commons moved across the lobby at Westminster, sat in the House of Lords. The House of Lords sat in the Queen's robing chamber, and parliamentary democracy in the United Kingdom continued as the bombs and the V2 rockets fell. They still met. They met in secret in some cases. Churchill would brief the Commons, 650 of them, in secret. But they still met. They still asked the questions of His Majesty's government, as is appropriate during a crisis. The greatest crisis the Western world has ever seen is not now. It was World War II. And the British Parliament met. Our parliaments all met because we did have restrictions upon us, nowhere near as grave the restrictions that we have on our liberties as now. And our state parliaments not meeting. And I think that is, frankly, dangerous.
Yeah, unfortunately, Daniel Andrews isn't Churchill. That's the problem we face here. You know, one thing that does surprise me a little bit is this support, maybe indirect support, that the Premier gets from our Prime Minister. I know it's a sensitive area, you may not wish to go there, but I'm still quite baffled by it.
Well, look, I think to be candid, the Prime Minister and the federal government are very disappointed with what has occurred in Victoria, and are frankly, like most Australians, absolutely amazed and outraged that this second wave started through government failure, the greatest failure of public administration in the nation's history. But they have a national cabinet set up. The National Cabinet is a subcommittee of the federal cabinet. The idea being that each of the state premiers and the Prime Minister are essentially at one on our response to coronavirus, which with our constitutional arrangements here in Australia, I think has been, not a bad idea. Because imagine if we'd had all the different states going off and doing various different things without coordinating through the PM. I mean, it could have been I mean, they have essentially done that because the border closures have not been supported by the PM. But I think having, you know, a multitude of different responses would have been even worse than what we're currently seeing. So, look, I know that everyone around Australia, including federal MPs, government ministers from the PM down, look at Victoria going, how did this ever happen? How on earth did we have this virus essentially beaten in the first week of June, and by mid-August we're in the situation that we're in? And they've said this. Josh has said this. Michael Suka has said this. You know, the facts are that 7 out of 8 states and territories managed hotel quarantine appropriately, used the Australian Defence Force as offered by the Commonwealth. In Victoria, they didn't. They used untrained private security guards. The virus got back out into the community, and now the rest of the country is imperilled by the decisions made by the Victorian government. They're facts. And as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things.
Yeah. What's the latest about this inquiry, judicial inquiry that the Premier appointed? Do you have any news on that?
The one thing that Judge Coate said that was very important was that there was no preclusion on the Premier or any other government minister or member of Parliament commenting or being asked questions, or indeed answering questions about what they knew about the hotel quarantine fiasco. So she essentially said, Daniel Andrews, if you're asked a question from a journalist, you have to answer. And that gave a green light to the journalist to begin questioning him again about what he knew about this disaster. And he has refused to disclose to the journalists, and indeed to the people of Victoria, what he knows and when he knew it about this fiasco. And I mean, the idea that we have to wait till November for a board of inquiry to hear what the Premier knew about the cause of the second wave of coronavirus in Australia, about a fiasco that has, you know, monumental consequences for the entire nation caused by his government's own failures, it's just unbelievable that the man doesn't have the decency to at least front up and explain himself. I mean, he has just lied and lied and lied and lied. And I mean, if I was a journalist sitting in those press conferences, when he got up the other day and said that the Australian Defence Force wasn't offered in March by the federal government, despite the fact he actually said that they were in his own press conference on the 27th of March, in his own media release, as the Prime Minister said at his press conference. I mean, I would have packed up laughing. I mean, the man has no shame. Daniel Andrews is the most bald-faced liar I've ever seen in my life. Hopefully, the people of Victoria see this man for what he is at some point.
Yeah, unfortunately, if you look at social media, I don't see too many people protesting against Daniel Andrews. I don't see the riots. I don't know. Some people just simply refuse to look what is happening here for what it is. And there is a bit of a catch-22 with the federal government, because as long as we've got the job keeper, the job seeker, exceptional pays going, then of course people are, in some respect, the majority of people are still in a comfortable position, and it allows Mr. Andrews to basically smash the economy indefinitely until and unless the federal government starts curbing on these indefinite hands out. We're going to end up here in a socialist government, in a socialist environment. And these are the things that are going to be expected beyond this crisis.
Well, look, obviously we don't want to see people in the streets. So I commend the federal government for what they've done in keeping the economy afloat. But you are right, we can't lock down forever. You know, there's going to be a point, hopefully, when we get this virus under control. Social media is very pro-left, as you know, anyway. So I think there's some very loud people on social media that are very supportive of Daniel Andrews. But I do think quiet Victorians in the suburbs are privately very, very angry with what's gone on here. But there is a strange paradox. I think there's a lot of people who are very angry with Daniel Andrews, but at the same time, they're very worried about this virus. So they're kind of hoping that everything that he has announced in recent weeks with regards to lockdowns and the like actually works. Because if it doesn't work, well, what's next? That's what people are worried about. I think they're angry, I think they're scared, but they want this to work. So hopefully we can get back to opening up the economy again. And then we have to come to an understanding, and I think Labor have to understand this. And if you look at Jacinda Ardern over in New Zealand, she's got it completely wrong. That you can't keep locking down every time there's a breakout. There's going to be breakouts of this thing until there's a vaccine, right?
Exactly.
So once we get the caseload down to an acceptable level, and the government still hasn't told us what success looks like. Is it under 100 cases a day? Is it less than 5,000 active cases, 2,000 active cases? I mean, what does success look like? What will be the trigger points to, in their mind, opening up the economy and then managing this virus long term? Because that's what we have to do. We have to cohabit with this virus. We can't lock down forever. We're going to have to work out a way of living in an environment where we do have this virus in our midst, but we have got it essentially under control. Because I say again, if over the next couple of years, every single time there is a cluster and we go and lock down 20% of Australia's population and economy, we'll never, ever get back on our feet. Ever.
You are right. I'm not sure whether you are aware about what's happening in Israel. So they are basically adopting the Swedish model now, because they are accepting that there is going to be between 1,200 cases to 2,000 new cases per day. That's what's happening right now in Israel. And the government has basically deconfined, allow people to go back to their lives, asking that people that have potential issues to be in confinement, and for everyone to do the best they can. And they madly researching for a vaccine. And I just interviewed an Israeli professor who believes that it's months away and not years away.
Well, if anyone could develop a vaccine for this thing in a very quick time, it'll be the Israelis. I have no doubt about that. I hear that the British scientists at Oxford University are not far up, heading in the right direction as well. But I've got great faith that the Israelis will be leading the charge on this. They always do. And I'm intrigued, though. Israel was one of the first countries to lock its borders down and to insist on permanent hotel quarantine for returned travellers. Mm-hmm. Israel seemed to have had the virus under control, and then it sort of got out of control. Why did that happen out there?
Well, it happened for very similar reasons than what happened in Australia. So the quarantine was not that great, and this thing, there's no doubt, spreads quite quickly. But what has changed, though, is that people went to protest in the streets. 10 days ago, there were protests all over Israel. They were protesting in front of the house of the prime minister, in the front of the Knesset, and so on, until the current government basically gave up. And they allowed the Israelis to go back to their occupation. And that's the news that I've got from Israel. Of course, everybody is social distancing. Of course, they are wearing masks. And they're doing all the right things about that we know is supposed to work with this virus, but they've gone back to their jobs and to go on with the economy, to try not to completely bankrupt the country, because at the end of the day, that's what was going to happen to Israel. That's what potentially is going to happen to Australia. I mean, this $1 trillion debt that we just did, and it's maybe not over, it's a generational debt. It's not, it's not an easy thing to comprehend.
No, it's not. But I mean, I'm an optimist. I think we've been in this situation before with a huge amount of debt. I mean, we had this sort of debt as we came out of World War II. And, you know, at the moment, with interest rates as low as they are, you know, that is to our great benefit until that changes. But I'll tell you something, at least we went into this crisis with a pretty solid balance sheet in Canberra. And we have a very, very skilled treasurer in Josh Frydenberg. And I'm now sounding like a terrible politician, but thank goodness we had a Liberal government when this thing hit, as opposed to our opponents, because, you know, I have great confidence that these various measures, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, well, JobKeeper in particular, at some point, I believe that they've extended it briefly, but that will be turned off. And because we can't do that forever. Now, if you had the Labor Party in, well, God knows what would be going on.
Well, I think that the Labour Party would not be as aggressive in terms of the debt. But, you know, Tim, we are subject to the same economical laws as any other country. And when when you create that kind of debt, it comes from either borrowed money from other countries, such as China, or you are going to print money. And if you do that, then you've got Milton Friedman theory that applies, which is it's going to create inflation, and that will have a flow-on effect on interest rates. So just on what you said, it's not because the current interest rates are low, given that the amount of debt that we're taking on, it might you might start seeing a bit of a reversal on that score.
And look, the Victorian government's got this issue where we've got 70 billion in debt because they borrowed 25 billion before the last election. Sorry, we had 25 billion in debt before the last election.
Yeah.
They announced 3 days before the last election they borrowed another 25 billion, and then they borrowed another 20 odd billion because of coronavirus. So Victoria's got more debt than it's ever had in its history. And unlike Canberra, where you've got some people in Canberra who I genuinely believe know what they're doing in Treasury and also around the cabinet table, in Victoria, I have no confidence that anyone has any idea what they're doing with regards to the management of these finances and what on earth they're going to be spending this money on going forwards.
So, Tim, you are sitting in your office in your electorate. You getting much feedback from your constituents?
I've never had more correspondence in my life as a member of Parliament. The phone doesn't stop. My staff are working incredibly hard, dealing with the volumes of correspondence, whether that be from local small business owners wanting support and assistance on how to access various government payments after they've been closed down, constituents ringing up or emailing about various different restrictions and rules about what they can and can't do. For people who are lonely, lost, requiring assistance, it's incredible. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And obviously, I have been very outspoken in terms of my criticism of the Andrews Labor government, and there are a lot of people who are very upset about my criticism of the government because there are a lot of people who don't believe that this is an appropriate time to criticise the government. I completely disagree with that, as we've discussed. There are equally a huge number of people who are very supportive of my approach in criticising this government, who are very angry and wish to see people on our side of politics speak up for them and reflect their anger in public debate. And that's what I've been doing. So because of all those reasons, this office is very, very busy.
Yes, and how is the morale of people? How would you describe it?
I think people have cabin fever. I mean, everyone's locked in their homes at 8 o'clock at night. We're only allowed out for an hour every day. I feel so sorry for mums and dads who have small children that are locked inside all day doing homeschooling. They can only let them out for an hour every day for exercise. Then they're all locked in at night at 8 o'clock. I mean, this must be, with small children, this must be absolutely horrendous.
Tim, it was great to talk to you. I think that you are going to be a tremendous force in politics in Victoria and in Australia. And what I was saying before, I totally meant it. We're going to count on people like you, Tim, to bring the right policies that are going to be able to put us back in the right track in the future. It's going to take time.
It's going to take a huge amount of time, and it's going to take a lot of blood, toil, tears and sweat, as Churchill would say. And, you know, the task is in front of all of us in public life to get the country back on track.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for watching Frank Talk on YouTube. Please leave us a comment and don't forget to hit the subscribe button.